Thank you all. Thank you for joining me today. And thank you for your interest in my book with Ronnie Chatterjee, who actually is at Duke University, called Can Business Save the Earth? Innovating Our Way to Sustainability. And as you'll see here in a little while, really the latter question there, innovating our way to sustainability, probably gets more to the heart of what this book is about and what our arguments are going to be. But to start off with, I wanted to do a little trivia with you. So this is purposefully blurred here. This is a picture of a gentleman, CEO of a leading global company. He was a pioneer in his industry. He was the first CEO within his industry sector to recognize that climate change was a serious issue that needed to be addressed. He put action behind his words. He put an internal cap and trade system, a trading system for reducing greenhouse gas emissions within his company. They set ambitious targets that they achieved actually years even before they were scheduled to be achieved. For his efforts, he received a number of different distinctions. He received a knighthood from Queen Elizabeth II. He received numerous awards from, for example, the Dow Jones Sustainability Index for having the most sustainable company within their sector. And in general was just viewed as kind of a pioneer in corporate sustainability. Anyone want to take a guess who this is? So this is Sir John Brown of BP, British Petroleum. Now, as many of you are aware, BP has had a number of environmental challenges and issues over the years, probably most prominently the Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf of Mexico in North America. That was not the only spill and accident they had. They had an accident in Texas City, Texas in the States, as well as a spill in the Alaskan pipeline. And as you can imagine, BP is kind of a pariah in the environmental activist community for what has happened here. Now, some would say that John Brown was just, it was all greenwash, as people say, that this was just all rhetoric and not really representative of the company. I don't know him personally, but there's a lot of evidence that there was real interest here and real belief that there was need for BP and other oil and gas companies to take a position in terms of sustainability and climate change. The reason I like this story is it highlights some of the contradictions when we think about this question we pose in the book, can business save the earth? There are many who think that business is not going to be the savior, but in fact is the cause of and leading to many of the problems we have within the environment. So the whole question seems to be folly. There's others, of course, who recognize that business is an important institutional player, one that is going to need to at least be part of the solution if we're going to address our sustainability challenges. So before I jump in, let me just share with you some just general thoughts about the scope of the challenge we're talking about here when we think about this question of saving the earth. So first and foremost in a lot of people's minds is climate change, of course. In many ways an existential threat to us as a people, as a race. Here we have a picture of Norway. These are some of the glaciers. You can see the melt coming off of those glaciers. The estimates are if all of the land-based glaciation, especially Greenland and Antarctica, melted, we'd have rises of about 50 meters or more globally. You can think about it sitting here in Hong Kong, what that would do of a 50-meter rise in sea level rise. That's obviously on the far extreme here, but there's concerns that we're already seeing sea level rise that will continue over the next few centuries here. When I think about climate change, it's not only about sea level rise, it's really about, at the end of the day, displacements and the like that might be caused by climate change, by the changing of different ecosystems and climates. So when I think about climate change and the impact on kind of human well-being, think about 50 million people in Bangladesh being displaced because of rising sea levels and what that might do to destabilize different regions, lead to humanitarian crises, and even political and social and economic crises as well here. So this is obviously a huge issue and one that we need to be thinking about. Just to put some numbers on this, again, I'm an economist, so I am not a climate scientist, so I just take on faith what the climate scientists are saying. If we take the Paris Accord, which set a goal globally to try to minimize global warming to 2 degrees Celsius or below. One way to think about that goal is to think about there as a stock of greenhouse gas emissions that basically the climate can hold. And we've already gone through a lot of that stock. And so there's going to need to be a limit to how much of the greenhouse gas emissions that we have globally from economic activity. And some estimates coming out of MIT suggest that what we're talking about here is ultimately decarbonization of economic activity by 2060. Let's think about that for a second, what that means there. This means substantial change across a wide number of sectors. And one of the things I'll talk about is that we're not going to achieve a goal like 2 degrees Celsius set in the Paris Accord without incredible disruptive innovation across a wide number of sectors. This is not about moderate change for corporations where they're maybe slightly improving their environmental impact. This is about wholesale changes across major sectors of the economy. We're talking electrification of transportation. We're talking renewables and other zero-emitting sources in energy production. We're talking about electrification as well as industrials. Industrials are actually a large contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Industries like cement, chemicals, steel production, and the like. So this is a tall order for us to address this issue. It's not the only issue we face, of course. Water is more of a regional issue than a global issue, but many regions of the world are having stresses in terms of potable water, some of it being driven by climate change itself. Many corporations, global corporations, are dealing with this already. Coca-Cola, AB InBev in the beer industry. For them, finding potable water is an obvious need for them, and they have global operations in basically every country of the world. And you can imagine how this is impacting a lot of different industries as well. Another issue that doesn't get quite as much press is the nitrogen cycle. So what you see here is runoff from an agricultural field. The use of chemicals, fertilizer, and the like in agricultural production creates, in this case, nitrogen that flows down through rivers and streams, eventually onto the ocean. There's a natural cycle there that in some scientists' mind is getting unbalanced because of these efforts there. This can cause biodiversity loss in a lot of these different ecosystems. Deforestation, another issue. Just last year, I had a trip that I flew from Singapore to Jakarta. And when you do, you can actually go and you can see where for the palm oil, they have deforested, hundreds of thousands of acres in Indonesia. That leads to both increases in global climate change, also leads to species loss, local issues with runoff and the like that all can be created from that. And then last but not least, it's important to recognize that just kind of what we might call our run-of-the-mill localized pollution is still an issue in many parts of the world, developing economies alike. In the States, we've had recent issues in Flint, Michigan with water quality. And so this is a persistent concern here that we have to be concerned about as well. So this is kind of the depressing part of my talk. I apologize for that. So the question becomes, what can we do about these substantial changes and challenges that we face? And again, it's a little bit of a red herring, the title of the book. The fact of the matter is the Earth's going to be fine. Right? The Earth was here long before us and will be here long after us. The question is, what's the quality of life for humans on Earth, and how are we going to live that? And I don't believe, even though I believe like climate change is an existential crisis, this isn't something about the disappearance of the human species. I think that's hyperbole. But again, it's about the quality of life we have and the potential for destabilization of population centers, different governments, and the like that are driven by these environmental challenges. So these are real and important challenges that we face. So the question that we ask in the book is very simply, what is the solution to this sustainability challenge? And in particular, what role does business and markets play in addressing this challenge? And I would just observe, if you think about the largest economies in the world, and you compare GDP of different countries with revenues for different companies, you do not have to go very far down the list to start to get to companies. In fact, By the time you get just below the top 10 countries in terms of GDP, you start getting some of the largest companies in the world, like ExxonMobil and the like, on that list. So companies are in many ways big international players, just like countries are. And so you've got to imagine that they have to be part of the solution in some way. All right, so here's our basic argument in the book. So once again, if we are going to address our environmental challenges, it's not going to require just simple incremental change by business and others to kind of make changes at the margin. It's actually going to require sustainable, disruptive innovation on a massive scale across a wide number of sectors. Again, electrification of vehicles, renewable energy and electricity generation. When we think about innovation, innovation ultimately requires commercial viability. So for new technologies, these new disruptive technologies, to really scale up and find widespread adoption, there's got to be consideration about whether they are commercially viable or not. So not surprisingly, if we're going to frame it this way, business has to be a critical player here in terms of advancing innovation. There's also a really important part of the story, and I'll talk more about this, for entrepreneurs. So entrepreneurs, as a creator of innovation, are going to be an important part of how we think about the disruption that needs to occur. And then last but not least, and probably most critical for our framing of the book here, is that innovation ultimately emerges out of the broader socioeconomic system in which it's embedded here. So at the end of the day, while this book talks about can business save the earth, what we're really talking about is how do you structure the broader socioeconomic system so that we can generate more innovation through our economic activity, more innovation that starts to address our sustainability challenge. And one way to think about that question is there's a lot of work that is done in economics and otherwise about how do we increase the rate of innovation, right? So assuming that more innovation is good. Here we're really talking about the direction of innovative activity. So we want to increase both the rate of innovation, but the direction of innovative activity towards these sustainability challenges. Okay, so let me do another pop quiz here. What has been the most significant innovation in the energy sector over the last decade? There's only one right answer to this question. Most significant innovation in the energy sector over the last decade. Solar cells, good guess, good guess. Wrong. Anyone else want to get a guess? Smart cities, very promising technologies there. Wrong. Electrification of cars, electric vehicles, I'll talk a little bit more about that. Wrong. All right, so let me share what I'm thinking here. Everybody know what this is? Hydraulic fracking, horizontal drilling. So if you know what has happened in the energy sector because of advances in hydraulic fracking, it has revolutionized the energy sector. In the United States, we have gone from a net consumer to a net producer of oil and gas as a result of this. Prices for oil and gas have come way down because of hydraulic fracking and the like. Coal, there's rhetoric in the United States about, what killed coal? This killed coal, okay? There are no new coal-fired power plants being built in the United States. In fact, they're being retired faster than they would otherwise need to be because natural gas prices are so low at this point. So in the US and other places around the world, hydraulic fracking has been revolutionizing the market for energy. Now what's interesting about hydraulic fracking is it's not a new technology. It's actually been around for decades. But it was about a decade ago where there were some key innovations that occurred that lowered the cost of fracking that made it more economically viable. And by the way, there weren't many people predicting back in like 2008 that this was going to occur. In fact, if you might remember, there was a point where oil, was around $150 a barrel. So we were at a point where people thought we were going to have much higher oil prices. Fracking occurs, suddenly those oil prices come down quite substantially there. So my point of this story is it's often very hard to predict where and how technologies are going to innovate and how they're going to change and advance. All right, another trivia question. This is my last trivia question here. Again, only one right answer here. What was the most significant environmental innovation from 100 years ago? So the turn of the 20th century, around 1905 or so. Want to take a guess there? Significant environmental innovation in 1905, around 1905. Wind. Wind's been around for a long time. Again, interesting answer, wrong. So, the automobile, otherwise sometimes called the horseless carriage. And the reason I say environmental innovation is there was a huge problem in major metropolitan areas with manure. The dominant technology at the time were horse-drawn carriages, and in the cities, the collection, disposal of manure was a huge, huge issue. Thousands of tons of manure per day in places like New York City. So along comes the automobile, and it in essence solves the environmental problem. But of course, as we all know, it created new environmental problems. And so this example highlights to me the law of unintended consequences. And again, solving one problem while creating others that we didn't foresee. So again, it is not easy to get the direction of innovation in the way that we need to kind of meet some of these societal challenges that we face. A couple more examples here for you. This is in reference to CFCs. If people remember the ozone hole, or old enough to remember the ozone hole in the 1980s, this is different, by the way, than climate change. This was a problem that was being generated in the atmosphere because of the release of certain chemicals, in particular CFCs, that were used in aerosol cans, also used in as a freezing for cooling and the like, for air conditioners and the like. The Montreal Protocol was a global initiative set up to basically ban or phase out the use of CFCs. Interesting kind of business story associated with it. CFCs were by and large a commodity chemical. DuPont was one of the largest producers of CFCs in the world, but it wasn't a high margin business. They made investments in R&D when facing this ozone hole challenge, and eventually came up with an alternative, HCFCs, which became the dominant technology in the wake of the Montreal Protocol. Now, what was interesting from DuPont's perspective is they took what was this low-margin commodity-based chemical and actually replaced it with a higher-margin patent-protected technology. And oh, by the way, there was another spillover problem with that, which is it's actually a very potent greenhouse gas. So we solved the ozone hole, and we created another problem with greenhouse gas emissions. They just recently had another international protocol signed to basically phase out the HCFCs with other alternatives there. So again, the law of unintended consequences. Next, I want to talk a little bit about renewable energy and some research that I've done a few years back looking at innovation as it relates to renewables, and in particular asking the question, where is the locus of innovation? Geographically, where do we see innovation? And I like this example because it really hits home some ways to think about why innovations arise where they do. And I apologize, this is hard to read, but this was a report we had out of the Batten Institute for Entrepreneurship and Innovation that I was a part of. And what you see at the bottom in particular is a few different types of renewable technologies, solar, wind, biofuels, and fuel cells. And what you see up on the map here, the heat map here, is patenting levels. So the countries that are of a darker shade have a higher portion of patents that they created in these various technologies. Well, the point I wanted to make here and share, and again, it's a little hard to read on the map, but if you think about, first of all, solar innovation, where are the leaders in solar innovation? Well, they tend to be in places like Japan, South Korea. Any guesses why those locations would be hotbeds of innovation around solar technology? Yeah. Okay, so they might have demand, incentives. They're kind of forced to innovate there. That might be part of it. Anyone know what is solar technology kind of most like compared to like other technologies? Anybody saw? basically like a microelectronic, right? Like semiconductors. So when you think about some of the leaders in semiconductors like South Korea, it would be natural for them to move towards solar cells and solar cell innovation there, given their historical expertise and success in that space. If we think about wind, anyone want to guess where is the kind of hotbed of wind innovation? You can kind of see it on the map there. It's a little hard. Actually, Northern Europe there. And there we can probably tell a story about historically there has just been a lot of investment in wind technology going back, like I said, 1,000 years. And yeah, and that's why I'm sorry. I'm going to do relative here. So if you look at the relative size of blue up in Germany, for example, as compared to actually, here we go. Look at this one right here. So Western Europe is the biggest one relative to others. Yeah, I know it's hard to read there, but if you look at relative here, Western Europe there. All right, biofuels, U.S. In particular, ethanol-based, corn-based ethanol advancements in the U.S. Some of that was by subsidy, by design. The U.S. has one of the largest kind of agricultural industries in the world, leaders in biofuels. And then last but not least, you have fuel cells down here. And what's interesting to me about fuel cells is it's hard for me to imagine what the story would be. And in fact, it seems more evenly distributed across the world. So there's no particular region that seems to be leading in fuel cell innovation. So just a couple thoughts here, again, is that there are these interesting historical contingencies that seem to drive why certain regions might be more innovative around a certain type of technology versus the other. And we'll talk more about that in a few seconds here. So getting back to the book is structured around kind of this little model here, real kind of what I call like a back of the envelope model here. So we recognize, first of all, that innovation is a process, and a process that moves through different stages from conceptualization, research, eventually through commercialization and diffusion. And in the economics of innovation literature, we talk about two dominant kind of attractors, if you will, for innovation. There's the idea of demand pull. Basically, necessity is the mother of invention here, is that if people are demanding these technologies, people will put money into innovating them, and that will create the new technologies. The second observation is technology push, like an attractor here. This is the idea that, engineers are in the lab, they're kind of figuring things out, and as they do, that generates new ideas that eventually find purpose in the world. There is vast literature debating which is more important, technology push or demand pull. Not surprisingly, the answer is both, right? They both matter to some extent. But they do differ. They do differ in terms of how you might think of them from a policy standpoint. They differ in terms of what might actually generate these two attractors. So around them, we have four major stakeholders that are kind of central to business activities. The innovators themselves, investors, the managers, CEOs and the like, and then ultimately the customers. But equally importantly, surrounding this innovation system are a set of intermediaries, both private and public. So this is going to be government policy, this is going to be activists, NGOs, universities. They all play a role in how the innovation ecosystem operates. So the question we're ultimately asking and try to work through is, how do we think about this collection of stakeholders and how they impact that innovation process, once again, to increase both the rate and the direction of innovation towards the sustainable technologies that we need. So I'm going to apologize. My examples are embarrassingly Western here. So most of these are US based, and so I apologize for that, but those are the ones I'm most familiar with. This is Mark Harriman here. He's an entrepreneur, graduate of Princeton University, and he had an interesting observation about carbon, which is, we talk about the problem of carbon in the atmosphere, but then there's a whole bunch of products that use carbon, right, carbon-based products. How could we maybe marry those two things together? How could we maybe extract carbon from the atmosphere and make products? So what you have here is their air carbon product for New Light Technologies, it's the name of his company. And this is a viable product. They actually work with IKEA now on some products, like basically plastics that they create using methane that it's extracted from the atmosphere to create their product here. The reason I include his story here is this didn't happen overnight. In fact, they put 10 hard years of R&D into this process before they had a commercially viable product. So mom and dad probably started. I'll talk a little bit about that, but it was a combination of venture capitalists, angel investors, probably mom and dad to start off with here, family and friends. So first, when we think about the innovator is genius, there's a common, especially in the States, the idea of two people in their garage innovating the future, and there's a little bit of truth to that. But in fact, most innovators are actually happening, again, in a broader system of relationships and the like that support them. And so, one, observe that innovation takes time and energy, right? This doesn't usually happen overnight, despite the stories we sometimes say. In economics, we have this idea of appropriability or appropriation, and it is key to understanding private R&D investment. So appropriability would be, how can the inventor or innovator gain from their innovation? So think of things like the patenting system that most countries have. That, in effect, is giving monopoly rights to an innovator so they can recoup their investment in the technology. Right? Learning curves are absolutely critical. So just simply the idea that as we spend more time putting research into a technology, as we spend more time maybe manufacturing, commercializing a technology, we can often get improvements in that technology. I'm amazed how often very smart people don't seem to grasp the very simple concept of a learning curve. General Motors, back in the early or mid-1990s, looked at hybrid vehicles. They looked at them and they said, you can't make money off this. We've done the economic analysis. These things lose money. There's no way you can make money. Toyota looked at it and they said, you know what? General Motors is right. Today, you lose money on hybrid vehicles. But tomorrow, we're going to get a little better, and the next day, we're going to get a little better. And in fact, they did lose money on the Prius at first, but they marched down that learning curve, and it actually became one of their higher margin vehicles over time as they learned. Was in a conversation just 2 weeks ago about the industry. And the response by someone is, the solar industry isn't a real industry. There's no way to make money off of it. It's just if it exists purely because of government subsidies and the like. Probably true a few years ago. The fact of the matter is, solar has an amazing story where it has marched down the learning curve and it is at incredibly low prices relative to where it was even 5-10 years ago, and in fact is the economically low-cost energy source, at least in some applications, subsidies aside. Learning curves are an incredibly important part of our understanding of how technologies evolve and disrupt one another over time. How many of you have heard of Joseph Schumpeter? Famous economist. What you might have heard is his phrase, he coined the phrase, the gales of creative destruction. So he was one of the first people to really observe that one of the hallmarks of capitalist economies is the ability to create the incentives to innovate, to spend money to innovate and develop new technologies. However, he had actually an internal conflict. In his earlier work, he emphasized the role of entrepreneurs and how critical entrepreneurs were to create these gales of creative destruction. But later in his career, especially post-World War II and seeing things like the Manhattan Project, recognized that sometimes it requires large incumbent companies who have the scale to invest to innovate new technologies. So when you think about innovation and it relates to clean technology, you can imagine that you're going to get differences. So maybe two people in their garage will innovate a new solar technology. Probably unlikely that two people in their garage are going to innovate a new nuclear energy solution. Just assume for a second with me that nuclear is a environmental good. Likely it's going to take a larger company who has the resources and the like to make an investment in something like nuclear power innovation. Last observation I'd make is that innovation districts and entrepreneurship are all the rage now in North America, in Europe, throughout the world. You've got some of the most dynamic kind of innovation districts in the world just a little bit north of you here. And so how, again, do we create those ecosystems for innovation and entrepreneurship are going to be critical to our discussion. I won't belabor kind of the levers right now, but the main point I would make is that when it comes to environmental policy, there is so much effort placed on the demand side of the equation. Let's put a price on carbon, let's create a cap and trade system, put a carbon tax in, whatever it might be. And that might be absolutely helpful and maybe critical to advancing sustainable technologies, but it is not the only lever available to us. And in fact, there's a whole bunch of things that governments can do, for example, in supporting R&D, in supporting university research. Maybe it's tax credits, maybe it's prizes. People may have heard of the X Prize. Perhaps it's creating incubators and accelerators around clean technology as a way to advance them. And let's not forget education and immigration policy in the U.S., bringing in talent into the U.S. to help innovate new companies and could be part of the solution as well. So there's lots of different levers that we could pull to help drive that innovator as genius, but it's just hard to, it's, I think, underappreciated sometimes in policy discussions. Yeah. In what way? Yeah. Yeah. No, I would completely agree with that. And again, it kind of goes with the theme that, we all have a role to play here. 1 second. I think I lost my Wi-Fi connection. I don't need that, but I need to get the message off the board there. Okay. So this is an example that probably many of you are familiar with. This is Elon Musk with the Tesla 3 Series, I believe, or maybe that's the S class. Tesla is a fascinating story, and I think there's maybe a tendency to think about Elon Musk as kind of the ultimate environmental hero here, right? By his own will and hard work, he has created the electric vehicle industry. And again, there's always a little bit of truth, a kernel of truth. I'm a fan, but it's also important to recognize that there were a lot of other players that have helped Tesla along the way, including financiers, investors, of course, even government, subsidies and programs that have supported him. And so it takes more than just kind of that heroic individual here to bring an innovation to market. So our third chapter talks about kind of the manager as hero idea. And again, even a passionate manager needs support to be successful. Now, the good news is there is abundant evidence at this point that green is profitable. And this is areas where I've done empirical work over the years. I've worked talking about lean is green, so you think about lean manufacturing principles that apply to green and the like. But I also think it's very important for us to recognize that there are limits to the it pays to be green argument here. And I think for those of us who've been in this space for a while, I started work in this area in the mid-1990s. It's pretty easy to get jaded because I think a lot of what companies run into is they get the low-hanging fruit. They find cost savings through energy efficiency, maybe it's a recycling program, whatever it might be, but they run into a wall pretty quickly in terms of being able to make the next step. And so this fourth bullet point becomes critical again, that this idea that disruption is key. This is really about redefining products and business models. It's getting yourself out of the usual trap here. And so when it comes to kind of standard corporate sustainability initiatives, those are critically important, but they might not be sufficient without really rethinking maybe your business models and your products at the end of the day. Now, one thing that was kind of important for my own evolution in thinking is I've been doing a lot of work on kind of corporate sustainability for many years. And especially in the wake of 2008 with the global financial crisis, a recognition that maybe we don't need companies to be changing as much as we need companies to be displaced by other companies. So you think about General Motors, who was bailed out by the U.S. government. There was many reasons to do that, including protecting jobs in the greater Michigan area. Very good reasons to do that. But one of the arguments being made was, well, this will help make General Motors a more green company. We're going to require that as part of their bailout. And that always struck me as kind of folly. I mean, they put about $40 billion into resurrecting GM. Maybe that $40 billion could have been spent on a venture fund for new electric vehicles and new companies. Again, this is a hallmark of capital economies, is this idea that new innovations, new technologies come about, and new companies often are the leads in bringing those about there. So at the end of the day, you actually don't need every business to be investing in sustainability. You just need some who are innovating new technologies who displace the old competitive order. And we talk about a couple of levers here, just that, again, that I don't think are often put into our conversations about sustainability, things like corporate governance and antitrust enforcement. You know, are you creating the conditions under which that ferment is created by new technologies and new businesses coming into the marketplace? A couple more examples here. This is a technology in the gentleman's hand here from the Climate Corporation. It was actually two former Google employees who started this company. They recognize that agriculture is a big impact on the environment through a number of different ways, including impacts on greenhouse gas emissions. And so they leverage technology to help farmers be more sustainable in their farming practices. Now, the reason I like to bring their story up is it gets to one of the questions that was asked on my first example, which is, well, how did they fund this? Well, in fact, they had a whole series of funding. They started with friends and family. They had some angel investors. Then they were able to attract Khosla Ventures, one of the venture capital firms in Silicon Valley, who put in a few $1,000,000 and really helped advance them further. And then last but not least, they were actually acquired by Monsanto. And Monsanto further put in capital and helped scale them even further. So these two, people in a garage, which was pretty accurate in this description here, required a lot of other support from investors to be able to get to the scale that they're making an impact now. So let's talk a little bit about the investor world here and how it relates. Hopefully. There we go. Okay. To be clear, investors are looking for a return on their investment. We need to recognize that. Clean technologies don't always fit well with existing sources of capital. So in the example I just gave, venture capital was interested in it. For a lot of clean technologies, they're not really amenable to venture capital. There was a bubble in the kind of 2009 to 2011 period in Silicon Valley where there was a lot of investment in clean technology that people got pretty jaded about pretty quickly. Partly because the nature of venture capital is you want to be able to scale quickly and exit within 4 or 5 years. So Facebook is the ultimate venture capital investment, right? Two guys in their dorm room in Harvard created a $1 billion business within like 48 months of when they started. That's a great investment, right? If you come up with a great solar technology, you're going to have to build out a lot of capital to be able to scale that business up. It's not necessarily going to happen in 24 months that you're going to have a $1 billion company. So as a result, you could almost argue there's a market failure in the capital markets for dealing with this. The good news is there's some solutions that people have been innovating. One of them is, of course, impact investing and socially responsible investing. So they're seeing a broader movement now of those who are looking for other metrics for success beyond just return on investment in the narrowest sense. There are things like down the bottom here, green bonds and green banks have been proliferating now. And so those create opportunities for debt financing typically for various types of investments. There's markets for technology and crowdfunding that are evolving now and creating new markets for investment here. And then let's not lose sight of the fact that what might help some of these technologies is more of an investment in actual infrastructure. So, for example, in the renewables space, you really could use quite a bit of investment in the grid technology itself. So the idea of a smart grid. And so that might require public investment to help create the conditions under which others could innovate and plug into that. Not too different than what happened with the internet, where there was public investment to create the platform that then became a genesis for innumerable innovations in that space there. So again, when we think about the investor class, critically important here, think about new ways in which capital can be brought to bear on green technologies, both from a public and a private sense. Almost done here. All right, this is the Nest product. Maybe some of you have seen or familiar with. Nest was another entrepreneurial startup. This one was eventually bought out by Google. What's interesting about the Nest is they were by no means the first digital thermostat on the market. In fact, there were digital thermostats going all the way back to the 1980s that were on the market. Yet it took decades before the technology got to a point that it really resonated with customers and with consumers. And I think Nest's fundamental insight was that they needed to create something that was simple, programmable, kind of looked kind of cool, and that could meet customer needs really where they were. And so this last chapter I'll talk about is this idea as customer is king here. For those who think that sustainability is going to be driven purely by the goodwill of people who want green products, I'm not as optimistic on that. And I think the data bears that out. There is most definitely green consumers who are willing to pay a premium for green products. Largely a niche in the United States, largely a niche even in Europe and the like. Ultimately, you need to consider the value spread versus other alternatives. So we could dive deeper into, for example, renewables again. But the same time that solar has been coming down this curve in terms of its cost, you have a similar curve that natural gas has come down. Or not a curve in their case, but just natural gas prices have come down because of hydraulic fracking. So you have two competing technologies here trying to be the low-cost technology. So you need to think about those alternatives when you think about which one of these are going to resonate with customers here. Now, what's very clear is a lot of large companies have recognized there are risks that they have brand damage they might assume from the sustainability or lack of sustainability of their products. And that can help drive innovation, especially through the supply chain. So when a large retailer like a Walmart in the United States decides to be more sustainable, that actually drives innovation up the supply chain with some of their suppliers, product producers, and the like. Another thing to recognize is that there might be latent demand for green goods that could require information solutions. So in the United States, for example, it wasn't until there was the USDA organic food standard put in place that we saw a massive uptick in organic food purchasing, because before then you couldn't really tell what was organic or what was not. There are a whole bunch of environmental labels that are out there now, some of them privately generated, some of them generated by public entities. All of them are trying to solve some of this information asymmetry to try to unmask some of this green demand that might be out there. And then last but not least, I think what holds the most promise is when you can innovate new business models. We could argue whether Uber or other car services are an environmental good. Some have argued that because ultimately what they can do is maybe actually reduce car consumption because people won't own cars now, they'll use these types of services. That's an example of like a business model innovation as opposed to just a pure technology innovation. And so when it comes to the customer, we can come back to these kind of public interventions, these demand level incentives. So again, various types of taxes and the like. In different parts of the world, in the United States, these are very hard to get through politically. But you do see now, private solutions. So codes of conduct is something I've studied quite a bit, independent labels and standards, and even the actions of like environmental activists. One of the things that's really changed in a lot of parts of the world now is where environmental activists used to go and really attack governments to try to get them to change their policies. There's more of what we call private politics now, where they'll go directly after the companies themselves to get them to change their behavior. And for companies, it's a scary world in terms of activism these days, because where it used to be large organized activist groups, let's say Greenpeace, who would protest a company, now all it takes is two people with a clever idea and a video camera to post something on YouTube and create billions of dollars of brand damage overnight. And there's lots of examples of that happening now. So a lot of companies are kind of waking up to the risks associated with their environmental footprint, and that's, again, helping drive some innovation down the supply chain. So let me just end by saying here that we end with this idea as the system is a catalyst. So again, the title is a little bit of a red herring here. Can business save the earth? The good academic answer is it depends, right? It depends on the actions of all of these stakeholders and how they influence that innovation ecosystem that we operate here. And so it really will take a concerted effort, not just from governments, not just from business leaders, but all of these stakeholders if we're going to move ourselves forward to create the sustainable, disruptive innovations that we need. And again, especially when it relates to climate change, the pace at which we need those to occur is quite daunting. So if you're interested, as part of a follow-up to this book, I'm involved with something we call the Business Innovation and Climate Change Initiative at UVA. And we've been doing a series of reports analyzing various sectors to see what is the likelihood that they will decarbonize by 2060, again, using this MIT analysis as a target for us. I can tell you we've done 2 of these reports so far, one on electric vehicles, one on energy, electric utility sector. We're doing a 3rd right now on industrials. I'm actually fairly bullish on automobiles. There's a lot going on right now that suggests that we might actually be reaching a tipping point where we'll see massive adoption of electric vehicles. I am less optimistic when it comes to the energy sector. And there's a number of reasons why. When it comes to renewables, for example, once you get to about 40% penetration on the electrical grid, intermittency becomes a huge issue. And there are issues about the reliability of the grid when you have large renewable energy sources on there. Storage is a huge issue. We need to find storage solutions that are economical if this is going to work. And there's also just the lag in time with these investments. So for example, even the auto case here, even if you could wave a magic wand and have every new vehicle sold today as an electric vehicle, it would still take you at least 15 years or so to get the existing car stock off the road to be replaced with electric vehicles. Similarly, with the electric utility sector, to be able to get complete replacement with renewables versus natural gas and coal and the like will take decades before those other assets are retired. So they could happen quicker depending on policy, but again, it's going to take a real concerted effort here by a variety of different players to create the conditions to get the transformation we need across these sectors. All right, let me end there, but I really would like to open it up to any questions you have, thoughts you have. I'd love to hear thoughts on kind of more of an Asian perspective, because I know a lot of what I just shared with you comes from more of a North American set of examples and the like.
We have about 10 minutes for your Q&A. Please.
Do we need a hand mic, so?
Thank you. I can't speak for the Asian perspective, I'm sorry, but I'm interested in this system approach. So what does it take to get these different stakeholders to one table, or to cooperate, or to work as a system? What are your ideas on how to bring the system together?
So one of the things we've done with our Jefferson Innovation Summit, with our Business Innovation and Climate Change Initiative, is we held something called the Jefferson Innovation Summit. We did it in DC in February. We brought 50, we called them delegates together from all of these different stakeholder groups. So from the media to academia to business to policymakers. And we ideated some things that could be done on that collective level. So we have a policy playbook that's coming out very soon that talks about some of those ideas. And we recently had an event in DC where we tried to motivate some collective action there. I'd love to be able to say, we did that and there was this huge uptake and here we go. So it's a work in progress. And I think, especially in the United States, we're at a point right now where we're not seeing leadership from especially the executive branch, and we're not going to see leadership from the executive branch on these issues. It is going to take some consortium of perhaps state and local governments. There's actually a lot of mayors and others. Mike Bloomberg has put together a consortium. And there's a lot of companies, a lot of US-based companies who are interested in still making progress here. So that's the optimistic side. But it's hard. It's hard to get that kind of collective action and have it be meaningful.
On that point, I wanted to share a story with you. Some of you know I grew up in Ohio. I work for the state of Ohio representative and the role of states. in 1990, early 90s. I think you guys heard the story of President Xi Jinping arriving in Iowa as a official, a young official, being welcomed by the Iowa state government. I played the role of Ohio State Representative, and we had a group of 5 governors from inland provinces. Sichuan, Ohio has a Hubei, and Hubei has a sister state. So 5 provinces, these were inland state governors. And this is early 90s, and they salivated. So they arrived in Ohio, and I had the privilege as a young official taking them throughout the state, Cincinnati, Cleveland, and the planes came from GE, Cincinnati Millicron. Everybody wanted to sell them aircraft engines or machine tools, but the governors from China was interested in Ohio's clean coal technology. Because Ohio has coal, and they developed clean coal technology, acid rain, the complaint from Canada, and they were ahead of the curve. This is about 30 years ago, 30 years ago. And the governors at that time, they did not have the cash. This is, again, late 80s, early 90s. And I often wonder, some of you know I'm a movie buff, I want to go back to the future. If I was Michael J. Fox, I want to go back to that moment and convince the public-private partnership of either state of Ohio governors to, what if we had sole or just partner with the governors on the clean coal technology in that time period? How different would our life be? And so the role of governor of the states that you mentioned, I think it's something that we don't think about. We think the leadership has to come from federal or but I think the provincial and state government. So that is my Back to the Future moment. If I could do that,
I would observe another thing is that the beauty of technology and innovation is that when you come up with that great technology, it diffuses relatively quickly. Like once the power of markets take over, things can happen very quickly. So it doesn't necessarily need the UN to approach this. All we need is various entities to be making investments in the innovation. If they, again, drive costs down, then it should diffuse pretty quickly. And I think that is sometimes missed in these discussions because there's a thought like, oh, if we're going to solve climate change, it's got to be done through some, global UN type of action. And I'm not sure that's exactly right, again, because again, it might create the conditions to incentivize people to innovate, but maybe there's ways to do it without that superstructure, just given how hard it is to do.
Well, apart from government policy, which I think a lot of us are frustrated with right now, I'm just wondering if the business model always works. And I'm thinking about the automobile industry, and I'm thinking about Tesla on the one hand and Ford on the other. I mean, Tesla is getting hammered in the stock markets. They're overextended, and the new president of Ford announced that he was going to get rid of the Fiesta, all the small cars, and they were going to move into 15 to 20 mile a gallon SUVs. So what are your thoughts on that? Yes, please.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing with Tesla is I think we should all be rooting for Tesla, but the fact of the matter is when technology shifts occur, so a couple things happen. We often see massive entry into new technologies, and then we see a shakeout that occurs. So it wouldn't be shocking if Tesla fails. That doesn't mean that electric vehicles are going to fail because Tesla fails. I think that's, again, it's a point that's often missed. In the States, we had this investment by the government in a company called Solyndra, and Solyndra went under it, and people are like, oh, the solar industry isn't viable. It's like, nope, this is exactly what you expect to happen in the advent of new technology. You'll get lots of people experimenting, lots of people entering, and lots of people failing. So the U.S. automaker market, and actually this was globally as well, you could replicate it across other economies, at the turn of the 20th century again, so going back 100 years, there were thousands of auto manufacturers, and most of them went out of business. So that's part of the process there. So I think Tesla's challenge right now is simply, can they scale? Can they scale? That's their big challenge. In terms of Ford, I just think it's short-term thinking versus long-term thinking in their behalf. And what really has moved the market, I think, more than anything, is Tesla's announcement of the 3 Series. So Tesla announced their 3 Series, and within 48 hours, they had 200,000 people put a $1,000 deposit down for that car. Do the quick math. That's $200 million. They raised $200 million in 48 hours for the thought of a car. I'm actually one of those people. I have my money in. I'm like, where's my car? Haven't gotten it yet. They keep giving me emails saying you'll find out in 6 more months. But that made all the other car manufacturers wake up. Maybe not Ford, but Mercedes, BMW, Volvo. They all said, we're in. We realize now this is an important, viable market, and there is a market here. The other players, by the way, you need to watch are the Chinese manufacturers. Some of the leading electric car manufacturers now in the world are Chinese manufacturers, and that's happening very, very quickly, and I think it's only a matter of time before they start moving into other markets and selling those cars. And again, the tipping point is when those vehicles, and really storage is going to be the key here, gets cheap enough that it actually becomes the low-cost alternative for vehicles here. And the thing that's interesting about electric vehicles, they're really simple machines, right? They're usually, maybe four electric motors powered by some drivetrain. And if you have an electric vehicle, it's usually a simpler, cheaper thing to build, except for the storage right now. So that's what Tesla's bet is. They're building these gigafactories with the hope of driving the cost of the storage down to a point that, again, it will be the low-cost solution. The good news is, technology always wins, right? I mean, imagine going back to like 1850 in the United States and being like, we're going to save the Nantucket whaling industry, right? That's kind of what some of the rhetoric is about, like we're going to save the coal industry. Okay, but why? I mean, if the world's moved on and these other technologies are lower cost and higher quality, why are we saving dying, dead industry? It's like, again, if you're familiar in the United States with like Blockbuster Video, like let's save Blockbuster Video who rents DVDs at a physical retail store. It makes no sense. So I guess I am an optimist, and I am kind of a technology optimist, that there will be a point in time in the future where we look back and we probably are going to say, why weren't we always using renewables? This just makes so much more sense. It's lower cost, it obviously has less impact on the environment. This is what we should be doing. The critical question, and what we're really trying to get to here, is how fast does that happen? How fast do these technology shifts occur? And are we going to do what's necessary to push them to be more quickly adopted in the world? Because again, with some of these challenges we face, like climate change, there is a time piece to this that's ticking here. And so unless we can get action going forward, these things might take decades, or likely will take decades to occur, and that just might not be quick enough.
Okay, these 2 questions.
Thank you. You mentioned to us that disruptive innovation isn't just about products and services, it's also about business models. Yeah. And sustainability isn't only about climate change and environment. So have you seen, and could you share with us, companies that are investing in even replacing their own products and services, disrupting their own business models so that they can stay ahead of the curve?
Yeah, I think, again, the auto industry is probably the one that's most easy to kind of get your hands around, where, again, there's heavy investment in electric vehicles now from most of the major auto manufacturers at this point. It's interesting, I just mentioned to some of you, I was at a conference we're hosting with University of Hong Kong on innovation and entrepreneurship, and there was actually a discussion about disruption in general and how incumbent firms either survive or not survive disruption. And history is not kind to the disrupted in terms of the incumbent firms. So the future might be new firms entering the industry and replacing them. So there's a lot, that gets a longer conversation of why incumbent firms struggle with new disruptions. So again, if I had to place my bets, I would place my bets on trying to encourage more entrepreneurial entry into some of these industries, because they're probably more likely to make the shift than existing incumbent firms. I'm sorry for those of you at kind of big, large companies. That's not what you want to hear.
Hi. Extending upon what you were just talking about, you did mention that disruption it involves displacing old industries. And I would argue that a lot of those old industries, so to speak, have now become based across Asia. Mm-hmm. And so do you think that this fact is going to create a drive for innovation, or is it going to slow down the rate of innovation?
That's a great question. There are clearly lots of historical examples of the old industry defending their turf and trying to delay technological shifts. And then again, that again can really delay some of these dynamics. I keep coming back, technology always wins, right? You can only hold back the tide for so long before the new technologies take off. And let's be very clear, I want to be very clear here. As optimistic as I might sound, there's no guarantees, right? We don't know. Maybe storage can't get any cheaper. And if that's the case, then we're in trouble here. But what's heartening to me is if we look again at these S-curves and we start to analyze them, you see some trajectories here that are really quite promising. Solar, for example, again, very much like semiconductors. And if you know Moore's law, where every 18 months there's a doubling in capacity, that's played out over the last, I guess, 30, 40 years now. We're seeing similar dynamics in the solar industry, which you don't have to go very far out in time, where solar will be so much lower cost than any other alternative out there. But you never know. You never know. We could reach some technological roadblock where we just cannot improve them any further here. And again, I can think of maybe people remember in the 70s. I'm dating myself here now. There are alternative technologies that we're going to take off that never did, right? So you never know for sure. But if you look at the trajectories right now, I'm feeling pretty good that some of these they're going to overtake the status quo, and by quite a bit once they're done. Take internal combustion engines for automobiles. We've been innovating them for 100 years, and so the number of research dollars that need to be spent to get a marginal increase in efficiency in internal combustion engines is quite large. So you don't get much bang for your buck in terms of R&D with internal combustion engines. You're getting quite a bit of bang for your buck right now for electric vehicles.
I'm just wondering, throughout your research, because we have talked in great length about the energy sector, automobiles and things like that, is there any industry or sector that you think it's not getting as much love or buzz as it should?
Yeah.
And maybe because the business opportunity is not there, or maybe for other reasons that it's not getting a lot of attention, but really should. And I'm just making this up, right? Or maybe in waste management or things of that nature. Like, what have you found?
So I think in terms of climate change, industrials again, and that's a broad classification for a lot of different industries. But trying to get the numbers off the top of my head, roughly, we're talking about 25% of global emissions come from electric utilities. So it's not like it's 90%. Transportation is another big chunk, but that one also isn't more than I think a quarter of all global emissions. There's a big chunk of it that is industrials. So again, that's going to be like cement, steel, chemical production, and that's not electrification. That's actual use of carbon-based fossil fuels on site. And so the solution there seems to me to be electrification. Like, could you electrify the production of steel? There's mini mills. There are ways in which that's already being done, but there's also some real challenges there. So I think that's one we don't really talk about as much. That's an opportunity. The other big one, by the way, is agriculture. So agriculture emits greenhouse gases, and how do you innovate that? I always say, probably one of the best things you can do to help the environment, and I'm the first who's often an offender of this, is stop eating beef. Right? We all hear that, So, so there's these other things that probably don't get as much attention as electric utilities and vehicles, and they make up over half the emissions that we have.
Okay, one last question. I'll give it to Jim.
What is the next sector you're looking at for the Jefferson innovation?
Yeah.
And to tie it back to Hong Kong specifically, I would suggest that real estate and property might be something to think about.
Yeah, and just the built environment. The built environment. When I think about environmental challenges, especially like in the United States, the one that I always think that we don't talk about enough is land use planning, because it affects us not only from climate change, because it affects how much we need to travel to and from work and the footprint we have. It also impacts our quality of life, and so we've built a system in the United States, mainly because a lot of our growth occurred after World War II, where the automobile was dominant. We built a highway system, and so now even the thought of having like a rail system that works doesn't work because everyone's so spread out. So there are those choices we make that are in the minor and we build here, we build there, but in the aggregate, they have huge impacts on what our environmental footprint is. So to me, that's like a really hard problem to get your hands around. Maybe in China, there's even a bigger opportunity because there's a little more central planning to that, where in the US we've decentralized land use planning to be a very localized decision, and so there isn't much coordination or even knowledge about how to design communities so that they have a lower input or lower impact.
Can I just comment on that? Disney is actually sitting in Shanghai, helping to figure out how you design smart cities. Because I think in the next 10 years, there's going to be, 100 new cities in China. And so Disney has an office in Shanghai trying to figure out, because all of their Disney
theme parks
are like small cities. And so they have MIT grads sitting there trying to, crunching the numbers and figuring exactly this question. Yeah. So there are people doing it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, urbanization at the end of the day can actually be quite good for the environment because you can get actually lower impact per person in an urban environment, but we have to design them in a smart way. And I think it has multiple solutions, right? It's policy and land use policy, but there's also just simple innovation too. I mean, the Internet of Things, AI, big data, all of our great buzzwords. I'll throw blockchain out there because whenever I talk, I got to throw out blockchain. All of those have a role to play here, actually. They have a very important role in terms of our ability to monitor and manage some of our impacts and behaviors. And so, again, there's a lot of opportunities for innovation beyond just the batteries, solar panels. And that's why I would emphasize, again, kind of business model and other things play a really important role here. Let me just quickly say, a vision for our electric utility grids are imagine we have distributed renewables, so solar, maybe wind, on everybody's home. You have a Tesla or some other electric vehicle parked in the garage. You then have abilities to do load sharing between the battery in your car and your home, the power in your home, plugging into the grid. You can load balance in interesting ways, but that requires like a massive upgrade in our electrical grid. It has to be smart. It has to do dynamic pricing. There's a whole bunch of business model innovations that need to happen. That's the future I think that Tesla sees, by the way. If you're not aware, Tesla changed their motto from being designing sustainable transportation to designing sustainable energy. And so I think that's their ultimate vision, is more than just automobiles. It's the smart home of the future with solar panels, batteries, vehicles in the driveway, all tied into a smart grid where you dynamically price and sell electricity back and forth. That's pretty cool.
Well, did CLP just announce that they're buying back the solar power from, which is right this month, right? CLP has the electric company here, so we're hearing this. But I think before I let you go, some of the things that you mentioned, the role of Asia and China, and because right now some of the companies that you mentioned, for example, Blockbuster, and later on Netflix made the transition, and also companies like Amazon and Alibaba. Yeah. I mean, are you looking at them? I mean, they're mega. And in terms of what they're doing, but are they the companies that you're also kind of researching on that? Both Jack Ma and Bezos have this vision of possibly saving the earth, but are you looking at those kind of case studies?
Absolutely. And that gets back to, again, that I think when we think about technology and innovation, I encourage you to think more broadly than just these kind of big buckets that we typically take about, and that I reference here. But I think information, distributed solutions, they've got to be part of this. And that's where I think some of the, either Silicon Valley startups or Chinese startups, they're not even startups anymore, but the behemoths are thinking in those terms. I mean, again, Google, why does Google buy Nest? Well, they recognize that, information is king. and Nest is collecting information about your behaviors in your home. And so they'll have a vast information trove of what's happening in your home.
Unintended consequences.
Unintended. Well, and there's a whole bunch of other issues then that we would need to think through with these tech companies. But there is some good that might come out of that type of information flows.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for your
Thank you.
wonderful presentation, and we look forward to reading the book when it comes out end of May, and we look forward to, I think, what you're talking about in terms of innovation and all these discussion, entrepreneurship here in Hong Kong. We've been kind of struggling with this, and it's ironic in that Hong Kong, I always felt, was a very entrepreneurial city, but now I think in some ways it's looking for its next big thing. So I look forward to welcome you back.
Thank
and
you.
On behalf of Asia Society, a small token of our appreciation, our
Thank you
current
so
exhibition, Love Long, Robert, Indiana, and Asia. So I look forward to future welcome you back and when the book is done.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. And thank you all for being with us.